So this session is about measuring SharePoint success. So it's about when you put in a SharePoint environment, then how do you determine whether you were actually successful? And that doesn't just depend on is the environment up and running. There's also other aspects that you need to take into account there. Just a quick introduction first. My name is Mirjam van Olst. I work for Intranet in the Netherlands as a SharePoint consultant. Up until last year, I would have said SharePoint architect, but I don't think that's really correct anymore. I'm a SharePoint MVP and a Microsoft Certified Solutions Master, so I was really technical at some point. And I run the Dutch user group, which is the ie.book. We have a magazine that's free to download, so go to the URL and you can download all the versions of the magazine with some great content also from the speakers here at the conference. I wrote a book, of which we gave a few away during lunchtime, together with Andrew Connell, Ted Patterson, and Victor Willian, of the people that are here. And if you want to reach me, you can do so through my blog, which isn't really up to date, or Twitter. And this is today's agenda. So it's all about success, and then how do we get there? How do we get to success, and how do we determine whether we are actually successful? So we'll start at the top by defining what success means for our environment, for our company. Then we will see how we can measure success in a SharePoint environment. Once we know what we want to measure, we of course have to gather the data in the environment. Then we have to interpret whatever we gathered, and then we can improve based on the information that we have from the environment. And of course, it's all about, basically increasing this circle, making it bigger and bigger, and eventually overlapping everything else. So we have to start by defining success for our environment. So what does it mean? Does it mean we make more money, we save time from users, we are very more efficient, we help users be more efficient? Does it mean all our content stored in SharePoint, that we have lots of visitors in our SharePoint environment? It can be lots of different things. If you look up the definition of success on the internet, you get a lot of different statements, and the same would be true if you would be looking up a definition of success for a SharePoint environment. So don't copy someone else's definition of success, but think about your own. So make sure that you come up with whatever is success for your SharePoint environment within your organization. And this sounds really easy, but it's not really, because it also depends on what's your role in your organization. If you are an IT person, maybe the only thing you care about is my SharePoint environment up and running. If you are a business user, the only thing you care about is, can I do my job, right? Am I not being hassled by unnecessary actions that I need to perform? So it depends on who you are in your organization and how you are using SharePoint. Within SharePoint, we can determine different workloads, and I don't want to go into a discussion whether this is the definitive 6 workloads that you can have in SharePoint, because you could have a couple of other ones as well. But these are some of the main things that we can use SharePoint for. So, for instance, we can have a collaboration environment where teams and projects, departments are working together and are efficient, even though they're not in the same physical location. We can have a documents and records management system where we store all of our information, and we are making sure that we're being compliant with all the rules and regulations that are around. We can have an enterprise search environment or a content management environment, which is just an intranet basically, with news and maybe functions that you perform a lot within your organization. We could use SharePoint as a social environment or to publish business intelligence information like Christina just showed. So a couple of different definitions of success on the slide here for the different workloads. So for collaboration, your definition of success might be that people are working together efficiently, they are collaborating on their environment, on the projects that they're working on or in the teams that they're working on, and they are being able to stay connected, to work together even though they might not be in the same location. For documents and records management, it might be that all of the documents are stored in your SharePoint environment in a compliant way, that we're not only able to store our information properly, but also able to dispose of the information properly. It doesn't stay around for too long, but it also doesn't get disposed too early, of course. And the right people have access to the right information, and we can actually see that, we can manage that and measure that. For search, it's easy. People are able to find the information that they are looking for across all of the systems that have to be connected through this enterprise search environment. Content management, that users are actually able to log on to the environment. They are doing so frequently. They are staying on the environment for a little while. And whenever they look for a function that is part of your intranet, they can actually find it. So as an example, our own intranet, it's not brilliant. If I have to look for a specific piece of information, I usually save it as a favorite because I'm never ever able to come back to the same page otherwise. So you want that to be better if you set up a SharePoint environment. You don't want it to be too big, you want it to be very clear where users can find certain pieces of information. On a social environment, you want users to work together to share knowledge. So it's important that people are actually active on the environment, that it's not just set up there, but people are actually browsing to it, posting to it. They're posting questions as well as answers, so that you have a lively discussion on the environment. And for business intelligence, you basically use SharePoint as the platform to publish information. So you want users to browse to that and to find the information that they are looking for in the environment. So even if you know your SharePoint workload and you have that definition of success, a broad definition of success, you can still argue about what does it mean exactly. So, for instance, for an IT department, probably the technical platform stability is the most important thing. Make sure that your environment stays up, that you don't have any downtime, that it's quick enough, it's performing. All of that's really important if you are in IT and you're managing the SharePoint environment. This is only relevant if you're in an on-premises environment. If you're in Office 365, Microsoft will take care of that. So you can try to measure, but there's not much point. Microsoft will do that for you. You can measure, but you can't manage. You don't have any influence over it. You also want to measure the usage in your environment, and you want to do this both if you're in an on-premises environment as well as when you're in Office 365. And this is the activity on the platform, and that's basically what we just saw, which depends on the workload that you're using in SharePoint. So how are you using your SharePoint environment? You can also combine different workloads where you have more functions in a single environment, which is fine. You can have multiple definitions of success for an environment like that, as long as users know where they have to go for what workload, where they have to go to do a certain action or a certain task, then that's fine. And we also have user satisfaction. So technically, we can have a perfectly stable environment. We can have it built to perfection as well. If users don't like it, if it's not what they expect, or if it's too much like hard work, then it still won't be a successful SharePoint implementation in the end. So we need to measure our user satisfaction. Which also depends on the audience, right? So who are you, what do you want to do in your SharePoint environment? And the best way, or really the only way to measure that, is by performing surveys, asking users how they feel about the environment. If you have a lot of users on the environment for a long time throughout the day, then probably people are relatively happy with it. But it would still be good to measure and to perform surveys and to see what are they thinking about the environment, what could be improved, what are the things that they really like. So that you know when you make changes, what are the things that you should be changing and what are the things that you should keep the same or maybe you be using more often. So that's important. If you do perform a survey, make sure that you don't make it too long. So I had a customer survey from an application recently which said it will take 20 minutes. There is no way that I'm going to fill in a survey that takes 20 minutes to fill in to help someone else do their job better. And that's true for most people. So make sure it's not too long and think about when you want to ask people about this survey. So it's good if you could do one before you start the project. So what's your baseline? And then every time that you make some improvements, you can measure again and see whether the satisfaction of users goes up. So then you're on the right path. You're going in the right direction and you know that you're doing the right things. So to repeat the same survey several times, that's really good. So you can also see whether feedback changes, whether users come up with different comments, and maybe some things that they felt weren't so good in the beginning are then better at the end. And also based on feedback that you get from users, you can sort of change the questions as well to make sure that you can dive deeper into certain things that maybe users feel aren't so good about the environment. Obviously, you can also make sure that you only ask the questions that you know will be answered positively, and then you come up with a really great result of your survey. Not as useful for managing it, though. If we're looking at gathering usage data, there's a big difference between on-premises environments and Office 365. So gathering the data is difficult anyway. There's not a whole lot that comes in SharePoint out of the box. That's only a few reports. So a lot of the things that you want to know specifically for your environment, specifically for the workload that you're using within SharePoint, you have to come up with ways to gather that data. Or you have to buy a tool that does that for you. So in on-premises environment, it's quite complex, right? Most of us can do a Rubik's Cube, but there's not many people that can do that by heart. We have to put in some effort to do that properly. If we want to do it on Office 365, where we have a lot less options to gather data, it becomes a whole lot harder. I probably wouldn't be able to do this even if I had a manual with it, right? So it's a lot more actions, it's a lot more things that you have to take into account when you try and gather data from Office 365. So in an on-premises environment, things that we could do, we could use full trust code, so we can just query the environment. And we can easily schedule that, so it makes it easier to gather the information. We can use SharePoint change logs, out-of-the-box SharePoint monitoring logs. And we can use the IAS logs to see how people are visiting the site, how long they're staying on the site. All of that we can do because we have access to the environment and we have access to the servers, we can access the logs. If we're in Office 365, we don't have access to any of that. We can't have full trust code, we don't have access to any of the logs, we only have access basically to anything that we can access through the browser. So to gather data, to gather information in Office 365, we would have to use the client-side object model. And we just basically iterate through our SharePoint environment, through our SharePoint structure, to request information that we need to basically determine whether we are successful or not. So we iterate over sites and site collections, and when you do that, you have to think about the scalability of your solution. If you have a small environment with a couple of hundred sites with a couple of gig of data in it, then you're fine. You will always be able to do this, and you can probably do this multiple times a week. We're trying to do something like this in my customer at the moment, who have around 9,000 sites and I think around 30 terabytes of data at the moment. So there's millions of documents in there. That means that I have to think really hard about what can I iterate and how often can I do that. So you need to determine the number of sites that you're iterating over. That's still relatively easy. And then the level of iteration as well. So for my customer, we have decided not to iterate to the document level. The information that we will gather will be site collection information, sites, libraries, folders, but not documents. Because if I would be asking information about each document that's in the environment, it would take months before I'm done with running my query. And I want my data to refresh weekly. So I have to make sure that, basically I have to make choices and sacrifices to ensure that my solution will scale to the level that it needs to scale. So if you're on your development environment, you can, of course, easily go down to a document level. And there's no problem at all for it to perform properly, and you can repeat it 20 times a day. But usually that's not the same scale as your production environment. So you need to make sure that you think about that basically when you start designing your tool, when you start designing the way that you will gather the data. So we can gather data, and then we have the facts. We can measure all of that, but we also want to know people's opinion. We don't just want to go by the facts that we can see, that we can measure from the environment. We also want to make sure that users are actually happy and that we are improving on them. Quite often, when you are working on an environment, when you are working on a project, you feel that it's improving, and you actually usually feel that it's really good because that's what you've been working towards. And also, you understand everything in there and the thoughts that went in behind it. So you understand all the reasoning behind it. But users that have to use the environment, they don't have that same experience, and they don't have that same behind-the-scene knowledge. So it's important to ask them to make sure that users have the same view that you have. And if they don't, that you can steer based on that information. So maybe the technical implementation of your environment is fine, but users just don't have enough knowledge to use it the way that they should be using it, right? So then you know that you should maybe offer more training, or in some cases even force them to do more training, right? Make it mandatory to make sure that they can use the platform the way it's supposed to be used, and to make sure that they are compliant depending on what the function and the workload of your environment is. Or maybe you need to do more change management and communicate better about what your SharePoint environment is all about, what it's supposed to be doing, and how you've designed it. Right? That could also really help, and then you might not have to change any actual technical things in your environment. You just have to communicate about it a bit better and a bit more. In general, communicating about what you're doing and what the thought behind it is will help with convincing users that the ideas behind your environment are good, and it will also help them to give feedback because they know what you were trying to achieve. So they can tell you which things you did achieve and which things didn't really work or they don't like. So these are the basics of what we need to know when we start measuring our success of our SharePoint environment. So we'll dive a bit deeper into the different workloads to see what type of information we could measure. Right, so the definitions are the same as were on one of the first slides with the 6 blocks on there. And things that we could measure for a collaboration environment are, for instance, the number of active site collections. So, like I said, my customer has 9,000 site collections, but we know almost for a fact that about 25 to 30% of that is not being used. And we can't know that for sure, but there's a couple of things that we could test. So we can see that about 2,000 sites have less than 7 MB of data in them. That's not a whole lot. So there's not a whole lot of documents in there. We know that. We can also see when the data was last modified in that site collection. So that will also help us to determine is that site collection actively being used. So that's also an interesting thing to measure. What we could also measure is the different things that we can use in a collaboration environment. So the number of calendars that are being created, for instance, or the number of comments and responses to blogs and discussions that are available or that are being used in site collections. Or maybe, and this is more of a soft one, the percentage of projects and departments actively using SharePoint. Right, that's also something that you could measure based on the information that you have within SharePoint. And for each of the workloads, the last bullet will be surveys, right? So perform surveys and ask users about how they feel about the environment. If we look at document and records management, then this is more of a formal process. So we could know the number of documents that are available in the environment. This doesn't require me to go down to the actual document level, so I don't have to request information about each document. I can simply look for the number of documents in libraries and throughout the environment. So this is a lot quicker than asking or querying SharePoint to see what's the metadata on each of these documents. Right? I don't have to go as deep down into SharePoint to get this information. The number of records, if you use records management within SharePoint, then that's also an interesting metric. Depending on how you set up records management, that's really easy or maybe a little bit less easy. If you store them in a record center, then it's easy because you just ask for the number of documents within the record center, and that's quick to find. If you use in-place records management, then this metric is a bit more difficult to get the information out of SharePoint. For document and records management, another interesting bit of information is what metadata is being used to tag documents and records. And what information you want to see here specifically depends on your organization, because each organization will have different types of metadata. So you could say documents per business, or documents per department maybe, or documents per legal entity. All of that depends on the type of organization that you are working in. It's also interesting to see whether users are actively using metadata in SharePoint, how many documents are not tagged with any relevant metadata. In general, if you have a document management system and there's active documents in there that people have to work on a lot, you want to limit the amount of metadata fields that people have to fill in every time they add a new document. Usually it's work in progress, people are still modifying it. There's no need to make it very formal and to have users fill in 20 fields every time they upload a document. You can also try and use default values for metadata, which will lighten the burden on users. So it means that they have to fill in less metadata because you do part of that for them by default, maybe at a site collection level, because you know what type of site collection it is. So that's an interesting thing. If you declare a document as a record, then perhaps you need to add more metadata because you need to be able to find later on what type of record is this, when was it declared, why did we need to keep it, what type of file plan is it, for instance. So all that information then becomes more relevant, and that's information that you don't need as long as users are still working on a document. Another interesting metric could be the percentage of document corpus that is stored in SharePoint. If you still have other storage types around, like file shares or maybe an open text system, and you want everything to move into SharePoint, then it's interesting to see how much is actually on SharePoint and how much is still in another system. So you want to be able to at least check that. And obviously, from a SharePoint solution, you cannot necessarily check how much information is stored in a different system, So you will have to go out and reach out to the other system to make sure that you get that information as well, and then compare it to what's in SharePoint. So like with the survey results that aren't automatically part of your SharePoint tool either, you can have other ways of gathering data besides just the technical things that you can read from SharePoint, that you can iterate out of SharePoint. If we look at a search environment, then here SharePoint will actually help us out, because there's some search reports out of the box in SharePoint. For instance, number of queries, most used queries, most popular queries, queries that don't return any results, because that will tell you, are a lot of users looking for things that they can't find any information about? Then maybe we need to look at that. Maybe users are searching for the wrong things and they don't understand what the environment is for. Maybe they are using the wrong terms and the information should be in there, but they just don't use the terms that they need to use to find it. Or maybe they are just going about their business in the wrong way and we need to provide more training. So these are the things that SharePoint provides out of the box. We have the number of queries at a certain level, the top queries, so the most used queries per day or per month, abandoned queries, so queries that returned results, but users never clicked on any of the results, so maybe it wasn't useful or they knew enough as soon as they saw results. No result queries, so which things don't return any results, and then specific query rule usage per day or per month. So a couple of examples of reports of what that could look like. So this is the number of queries in a specific site. And this is then per day, at days last year, and per month, the one at the bottom here. So this is pretty useful information if you have a search environment within your SharePoint environment. The top queries, so which queries are used the most. So you can see this is more of a document management system, so a lot of document IDs are being searched here. But this also gives you some useful information, because it means you know what users are looking for a lot. You can maybe put best bets in there, and if there's several results that show up a lot, you can make sure that they always show up at the top of the page, so users don't have to search for that as much, and they can see that at the top of their page all the time. If we have a content management environment or an intranet environment, I'm specifically not talking about web content management, public websites, because Microsoft's moving away from that. So the same would pretty much be true for an environment like that. But I think in this case it's more relevant to start talking about intranet environments. That is the way that Microsoft is moving towards. So we could measure the number of unique users that have accessed our environment, that have accessed our intranet. This, in a lot of companies, is really, really high, because when you start your browser, it opens up with the intranet. So the number of unique users is always the same as the number of users that you have within your company. So then you need to know how many users do actually click on a link instead of navigate away straight away from your environment. What are the most popular sites and items? And if your browser does open up with the homepage, then you probably want to exclude that, because that will be very popular. And the time spent on sites and pages and items by users. So these two we can find, or SharePoint gives us this information. Time spent on sites, pages, and items, that's a really difficult one. If we're in an on-premises environment, then we can find that through IIS logs. If we're in Office 365, unfortunately, we have no way to find this information out of the box, or through SharePoint. So you would need to deploy an add-on to get that information, like something like Google Analytics or Adobe or WebTrans, something that gives you that information other than SharePoint. And of course, again, we can survey. And here, survey is quite important, because we are trying to provide information that users like. They, in most cases, don't have to go to our environment. We want them to want to go to the environment. So it's important that they can find the information that they're looking for and that they feel the content is relevant. It's also important that we refresh the content often. So if we're providing news, then news from last month isn't really relevant anymore, especially not if it opens up every day. So things that SharePoint provides out of the box in terms of actual usage is most popular items and popularity trends. So unique users, number of unique users per day or unique users per month. This is what that looks like. So the popularity trends, how many times have documents been opened. This is for a specific site. So this is not across all site collections. Because Microsoft would have the same problem that we would have. If they iterate through a really large environment and try to come up with reports like this, then that would be slow. So this is information that you can collect for your site collection. Usage details, so how many times a document has been opened. This is for a specific document. So unique users on a specific day or in a specific month. And also information about a site. So the number of views on a specific SharePoint site, daily and monthly. This is all out-of-the-box functionality that you get with SharePoint. If we look at social, then we can look at the number of communities or groups or chats. And this, of course, depends a little bit on, are you using news feeds or are you using Yammer? Or if you use Yammer, then your SharePoint information is not going to return much, but you can query Yammer for usage statistics and get information about that as well. Newsfeed information is fleeting because it's not stored in normal content databases like most of the content. Microsoft stores that in a cache, which means that if you do anything, let's call it significant to your environment, the cache will be emptied and then the newsfeed's empty, so you can't gather data about that. And then you will get weird drops in your statistics if you gather data and you save that information. I think eventually we will all go to Yammer, but we're not there yet. What's interesting is the average response time in conversation. So if you ask a question on a community, how long does it take for someone to answer the question? Right, and there's really important that you can manage an active community. And it also depends on what type of people are in the community and can you keep that lively. In our own company, we had a pretty lively community which sometimes dipped when a lot of salespeople came in to ask questions like, do we have so-and-so proposal? If you get 5 of those, then the number of experts in the community will drop, right? Because there's all salespeople in there and experts aren't that interested. Usually in the sales conversation, they want the difficult technical questions. So it might be a good idea to have different communities for salespeople and have some specific experts work in there to help salespeople out when they need some information. And then the technical communities can actually be technical instead of sales related. Number of replies is also an interesting one, and then preferably not replies that say +1, +1, +1, +1, +1, because you can get a lot of those without adding a lot of value. And then, of course, again, the survey in there. And then last one, the business intelligence workload. Here you basically want to see users visiting the information, viewing the information that you surface through SharePoint. So you do less in SharePoint itself when you have a business intelligence environment. It's more about servicing the information that's stored somewhere else. So you mainly want to know, are users actually looking at that information? Are they finding it relevant? Which is then again the survey. There's less data to actually collect from SharePoint itself there. A couple of examples of what we could actually be collecting. So if you look at all these workloads and all the things that we can measure, then what would we request? And these things are all things that we can request using the client-side object model in an Office 365 environment. So the list could be really, really big if I would go over everything that's also, that you can also gather in an on-premises environment. All of this you can gather in an on-premises environment because in the full trust object model you have the exact same information at least as that you have in the client-side object model, and you can do more as well. Your approach will just probably be a bit different. So what we could do is the total number of sites, which is a simple count, and we could keep track of that in a database. Also interesting, the number of new sites, so how many sites have been created over a certain period. And for that, we need to make sure that we keep the data from the last period so we can see the difference. The number of inactive sites, and for that we use a property on the site collection, which is last content modified date. And in there you can see that an active site or an inactive site means that no content has been added. And this is a little bit challenging. Because in a lot of environments what you see or what customers ask is, I want to dispose of sites or content that no one looks at, and not necessarily that no one modifies. So if I have a report that's really popular, users are looking at it all the time, but no one's modifying it anymore, then you might dispose of a site because you feel that it's inactive because nothing changes, but it's actually very active, it's just being viewed. That's kind of difficult. We can't see that unless we have access to, for instance, IIS logs. So in an on-premises environment we could. In Office 365 there is no way to gather that information. So what you could do is gather this information, see when content was last modified. If a site isn't modified, then maybe reach out to the site owner and ask, is your site still being used? Do you know people are still visiting it? Right, so that you at least have a verification and don't just start deleting information. Inactive site owners is also an interesting one. So is the account still in Active Directory? Are users still in the company? If you have site owners that are no longer in the company, then you will probably want to assign a different site owner to make sure that the site is still managed. To make sure that when someone requests access, that email actually shows up in someone's inbox instead of in someone's inbox for someone that doesn't exist in the company anymore. Number of documents and records, I talked about that. Another interesting thing is broken permission inheritance. I inherited the management of a site collection recently, and that was a couple of weeks ago. I'm still trying to figure out the permission structure within that site collection. There's hundreds of places where the permission structure the inheritance is broken, which means that it's very difficult to find out who has access to what bit of information. So it would be really useful if you can see that within your environment. I think in general, training should be to end users, try not to break permission inheritance too much, and at the very least, don't do it below the site collection level. Below the library level. But it's very good if you can monitor that, if you can see who has access to what bit of information. That's also often relevant if you are being audited, if people are looking at your environment and they want to know who has access to what type of information. If there's formal information stored in your environment, then that's usually important to be able to gather this type of information. And you can't just gather this information from simply looking in one place in your SharePoint environment. So you would actually have to iterate to find this information, and then a report would be really good. And you can have people look at the reports and see where there's a lot of inheritance broken maybe, or where you feel that it might be sensitive data and a lot of people have access. And then you can again go reach out to a site owner and ask, are you sure that the right people have access to your site collection? Or are you aware that everyone within our company can see the data on your site collection? So this is a good report or a good metric to use as well. Then number of calendars and blocks and replies, you can simply iterate through that number of a certain type of list or all lists even. And another thing that's interesting is breakdown and then whatever metadata is relevant within your organization. So how do you divide your site collections? What type of metadata do you have on your documents? Do you have any default value set on site collections? So that's also interesting. So all of the reports that you can create, for all of those, it's interesting to not only break it down by time, so last month, last week, today, but also break it down by some metadata value that makes sense within your organization, by business, by country, maybe by role. Right? What's the role of the site owner within my organization? So all of that information is very useful if you can gather that and if you can report on that. And it will help users to manage the environment. Now, we don't just want to know what's happening right now. And if we're in an Office 365 environment and we have to iterate over our environment to gather information, we cannot even report on what's happening right now. Data will always be a couple of days or maybe a week old. But we also want to know what happened last week and what do we think will happen tomorrow. How can we move up with the arrow right up to the top right? So we need to store the trends, we need to watch the trends, and we need to make sure that we look at how data is changing over time. In this slide, you can see that we're slowly moving up, but it's very steady, very controlled. In real life, usually it won't be like that, right? Because we will figure out something that we think we should do to improve the usage of our environment, but maybe we got it wrong. So we seem to go up for a while, and then we dip down again, we go back up again, but we dip down again. So we have to continue to adjust. It's important that we measure regularly and that we try and steer based on the information that we get. But there's no way that we're going to get it right first time, right? Because if it was very easy, then all SharePoint environments in the world, well, heck, even all IT systems in the world would be a great success. And all of the implementations would succeed, and that's not the case. Right? Technically, it's not that difficult, but to actually make sure users are using the environment and are happy with the environment, that's a lot more difficult. It's easy or relatively easy to hire a technical expert, but to determine what to do to get users to use the environment, that's a lot more difficult. With that, it's also important that when we gather the right data, that we also can interpret the data. As we all know, if we have some information and we're not so good with statistics, or in some cases if we are really good with statistics, we can make the same type of information, the same facts that we gathered, seem to look like something is a success or a failure, depending on what we want to prove. Right? It's all about what we want to show to our management or to the people working for us. So we need to make sure that the people interpreting the data are objective and are actually interested in getting the facts out on the table and are also able to get the facts out on the table. So if you are gathering the information about your SharePoint environment and the person looking at it has no clue about SharePoint or the structure in SharePoint or what the goal of the SharePoint environment is, then that person will not be able to determine whether the data that was gathered shows that it was a success or a failure. So you need to make sure that you get the right people to look at the data that you're gathered, because otherwise you have a great tool, but you still can't do anything with the information that was retrieved from the environment, and that would be a shame. So here we see we have the tool, we gather data. We also need a service or people that look at the reports. Right? We've got all the information, we got someone that created the right report with that information, but now we need someone to interpret that and to determine what do we need to do with the information that we just gathered. For instance, how many inactive sites do we have, and is it worth it to reach out to site owners and ask, can we decommission your site to save space, to clean up the environment, and to continue to manage the environment, to steer what's happening on the environment. And this is more important than you would think at first glance. So I had a customer that we moved that customer to SharePoint 2003 in 2001, I think. No, that can't be, in 2003 probably. And they were on 2003 until 2012. So SharePoint 2003 wasn't that great of a system. And it didn't look fancy at all. It was like blue with some yellow top bars and the font was ugly. But the environment was managed very strictly. So there was a team actively managing site collections that were inactive, but also managing new requests for site collections. And because of that, they were able to make sure that even though it was a pretty crappy system, it still continued to perform very, very well for almost 10 years, which is an extremely long time for an IT system. It was very outdated, it didn't look nice, but it was still used a lot, and they did a benchmark to see how much money they made with the environment, and it was millions. Right? And also, I have a customer that is a lot smaller in size, that has a new SharePoint 2010, or relatively new SharePoint 2010 environment, but no one ever managed it. Users were just able to request sites, and whenever they requested the site, they would get a site collection. It's completely out of control. You can't use it anymore. It's too slow. There's too many site collections in there. So you can throw all the hardware you want at it, but it's more important to actually look at what's happening in my environment and making sure that I govern what's in my environment, that I manage the content that's in there. Right? If you have an SAP system, no company is going to install an SAP system, have some expert configure it, and then let all the experts walk out and give it to the users to have fun with it. Right? It doesn't work like that. And the same is true for SharePoint. You need to actively manage it to make sure that you can continue to use it and for the environment to continue to be performant and productive and scalable. And a SharePoint environment is expensive as well, and needing a new SharePoint implementation every couple of years is also very expensive. We might not be as expensive as SAP experts, but we can get there. Right? So we need to make sure that we manage our environment, that we monitor the reports, and then that we manage based on the reports that we see. And then we can start over again, gather more data, see whether we did the right thing, whether people are reacting to it properly, whether our environment is still performing well. Because we could also gather data about the technical performance, especially if we're not on Office 365, and then steer based on that. So we need to make sure that we manage it correctly. We need to manage the three different buckets, basically. We need to manage the technical side, the usage of the environment, and then the behavior of users. So we need to manage the governance of our system, make sure that it's scalable still, and we need to make sure that we motivate users to use it. So for that, we use change management. We can put in something like gamification, depending on the workload that you're using. Reward users in a creative way, in a fun way, if they are doing the right thing. right? I don't really, when I think about it rationally, I don't really like gamification. But then when someone challenges me and allows me to get badges for doing something, I still want all of those badges. So I think it really works. If you can figure out what the metric is and what you want users to do, and you can reward them for actually doing that, then that's a really good idea. And it shouldn't be too easy, but it also shouldn't be too hard. So if you get it by not doing anything, then it doesn't work. But if I know that I really can't reach the next step, then that doesn't motivate me anymore either. So you need to find a middle ground in there. So a summary of what we've gone through. We need to start by defining the success of our environment. What does it mean for our environment? When are you successful? Are you successful when users are visiting the environment, when all of my content is stored in SharePoint, when people can find the information they are looking for? And you can define alternative successes as well, like when we save money, when the old environment can be turned off. But the fact that the old environment can be turned off doesn't necessarily mean that the new environment is a success. So you also want some successes defined for your new SharePoint environment. Or if you already have your SharePoint environment for a long time, you want to define it for that. You need to determine what to measure. Do you want to measure how well your environment is doing technically? Do you want to measure number of documents in your environment, inactive sites? Really depends on the workload and also on who you are in your organization. Then we need to determine how to measure. So if we're in an on-premises environment, we have quite a lot of options, right? We can use full trust code to go through sites to request information. We can access different types of logs. We could even go to logging databases directly, so to SharePoint logging databases directly and request information and gather new reports from there. If we're in Office 365, we're very limited. We can basically request whatever is available for us through the client-side object model. But then don't just think about the information that we can get from SharePoint, also think about the information that we can get from users, like doing surveys and making sure that we know how users feel about the environment. Another thing could be, for one of my customers, we measure how many site owners completed the mandatory training. Obviously, that's not stored in SharePoint. It's something that's stored in a different database, so we just include that in our SharePoint report. So you can include data from other systems as well, and mix that with the data that you gather from SharePoint. Then we need to build the tool, and we need to actually gather the information and store it, and make sure that we keep the trends, that we can visualize how our environment is changing, how people are feeling about our environment over time, how their opinions are changing about our environments as well. And we need to interpret the data, so we need to find the right people to do that. We need people from the business, right, that can tell us how they feel about the data that's being gathered. But we also need people that understand SharePoint to make sure that they can help to interpret the data and to make sense of the things that we gathered from SharePoint. So that we don't just have people from the business and maybe they misunderstand some of the information that we gather from SharePoint, because that's quite a technical thing that we have there. And we need to make sure that based on all of this information and all of the hard work that we did, that we actually manage and steer our environment in the right direction. So implementing a SharePoint environment is not a one-off thing. We're not done as soon as we have the environment up and running and the last developer walks out of the building. We need to make sure that we continuously manage and monitor our environment to make sure that it becomes a success, and also to make sure that the environment is sustainable. To make sure that the environment stays scalable and performant and interesting to users. So it's a continuous investment. Of course, most of the investment will be in the beginning when we need to set up the environment, but you will need a team to manage it and you will need tooling to monitor it. So you're not done after the first initial setup of your environment. Before I let you go out into the sun and to the party, are there any questions about this? Thank you very much for staying in here in the heat and have a lot of fun tonight.